Good evening, and welcome back to the Quiet Library. Tonight, I'd like to introduce you to a man who owned almost nothing, yet taught generations of people what it truly means to be free. His name was Epictetus. Unlike the emperors, the generals, and the famous statesmen we've met before, Epictetus was not born into privilege. He did not inherit wealth. He did not grow up surrounded by marble villas or private tutors. He entered the world with no control over his own life. Epictetus was born sometime around the year 50 CE, probably in the city of Hierapolis, in what is now southwestern Turkey. Historians cannot say exactly which year. Even his birth was never considered important enough for anyone to record. That alone tells us something about the world into which he was born. Epictetus entered life as an enslaved child. Today, when we hear the word slavery, we often picture one particular chapter of history, but slavery has existed in many forms across many civilizations. The Roman Empire depended heavily upon enslaved labor. Millions of people throughout the empire lived without legal freedom. Some worked in fields, some in mines, some in households, some became teachers, doctors, craftsmen, or secretaries. Their lives varied enormously, but they all shared one reality. Under the Roman law, they were considered property, not citizens, not equals, property. It is difficult for us today to fully imagine what that must have felt like. To wake each morning knowing that another person possessed legal authority over nearly every aspect of your life. Your work, your future, even where you slept. At some point during his youth, Epictetus was brought to Rome. There, he became the property of a man named Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus himself had once been enslaved before earning his freedom. He later rose to become a powerful official serving the Emperor Nero. History remembers him as an influential figure within the imperial court. For Epictetus, his household became something unexpected, not only a place of service but also a place of learning. Despite his status as an enslaved person, he was allowed to study philosophy. Exactly why remains uncertain. Perhaps his owner recognized his intelligence. Perhaps Epictetus sought every opportunity to learn during the few quiet moments he could claim as his own. Historians simply do not know, and it is important to admit that history cannot tell us. But we do know this. The young man who had no freedom over his body began discovering a freedom of another kind, a freedom of the mind. Long before he ever taught another student, long before emperors admired his ideas, Epictetus had already begun asking a question that would shape the rest of his life. If another person can control your body, can they also control your mind? And that question would change philosophy forever. Outside, the city of Rome grows quieter. Oil lamps flicker behind open windows. Footsteps echo softly across stone streets. Somewhere, a young man with no wealth, no status, and no certainty about tomorrow. He just discovered that the most important freedom may be the one no one else can ever take away. And that is where our story truly begins. As the years passed, Rome became Epictetus's classroom. The city was unlike anything the young philosopher had ever known. It was noisy, crowded, restless. Merchants filled its markets, soldiers marched through its streets, senators hurried toward meeting that would shape the future of the empire. People from Britain, from Egypt, Greece, Syria, North Africa, and countless other provinces crossed paths every single day. Languages blended together. Ideas traveled as quickly as ships. It was, in many ways, the center of the known world. And somewhere within that immense city, Epictetus found his way to philosophy. His greatest teacher was a Stoic philosopher named Musonius Rufus. Today, Musonius is less well known than Marcus Aurelius or Seneca, yet in his own lifetime he was admired as one of Rome's finest teachers. He believed philosophy should never become an intellectual performance. It should change the way a person lives. His students did not gather simply to memorize clever arguments. They came together to become better human beings. That idea deeply influenced Epictetus. Years later, it would become one of the foundations of his own teaching. Philosophy, he believed, was not something to admire from a distance. It was something to practice every ordinary day. We do not know exactly what those lessons looked like. No detailed descriptions survive, but we can make a careful guess from the writings that followed. The classroom was probably filled less with speeches and more with questions. Not what do you know, but how do you live? For the Stoics, knowledge alone was never enough. A person could quote every philosopher in Greece and still become impatient, or selfish, or dishonest. Wisdom revealed itself not through memory, but through character. Perhaps that is why Epictetus spoke so directly. He rarely tried to impress people. Instead, he challenged them. If you claim to value kindness, do you act kindly? If you admire courage, how do you behave when you are afraid? If you believe self-control is important, what happens when someone insults you? These were uncomfortable questions. They still are, yet they remain surprisingly relevant. Modern psychology has shown us that lasting change rarely comes from information alone. Most of us already know many of the habits that would improve our lives. We know that sleep matters, that patience helps relationships, that gratitude can improve well-being. The difficult part is not learning these ideas, it is living them consistently. In that sense, Epictetus was asking questions that still challenge us nearly 2,000 years later. As his understanding deepened, something remarkable happened. The young man who had once arrived in Rome with almost nothing gradually became known not for his social status, but for the clarity of his thinking. People began to listen, not because he possessed wealth, not because he held political office, but because he spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had tested his ideas against real life. And perhaps that gave his words a kind of authority that no title ever could. He was not describing an ideal world, he was describing how to remain human, even when the world was far from ideal. Long before he became a teacher, Epictetus had already become a student of life's hardest lessons, and sometimes those become the teachers we remember the longest. At some point, Epictetus gained his freedom. Exactly when this happened, history does not tell us. The ancient records become quiet. We do not know whether his owner formally freed him, as sometimes happened in the Roman world, or whether freedom came through changing circumstances. We simply know that eventually the man who had once lived as another person's property became legally free. For many people, that would have been the end of the story. For Epictetus, it was only the beginning. Freedom gave him something he had never truly possessed before: the opportunity to choose how his own life would unfold. And he chose philosophy, not as an escape from the world, but as a way of living within it. By this time, Stoicism had already existed for more than 300 years. It began in Athens with a philosopher named Zeno of Citium. Generation after generation, teachers refined its ideas, yet Epictetus brought something uniquely his own. He had experienced hardship firsthand. He knew what it meant to lose control over nearly every outward circumstance. Because of that, his philosophy carried a quiet authenticity. He was not speaking from comfort, he was speaking from experience. Then history intervened once again. Around the year 89 CE, the Emperor Domitian ordered many philosophers to leave Rome. The reasons were political. Roman emperors often viewed independent thinkers with suspicion, especially those who encouraged people to think for themselves. Philosophy could ask uncomfortable questions, and uncomfortable questions sometimes made powerful rulers uneasy. So Epictetus left Rome, not in anger, not in despair, simply because circumstances required it. He traveled east to a Greek city called Nicopolis on the western coast of what is now Greece. There, far from the noise of imperial politics, he founded a small school. It was not an academy filled with grand statues, not a magnificent building with marble halls. It was something much simpler. People gathered to listen, to ask questions, to examine their own lives. Students came from many different backgrounds. Some were wealthy, some held important positions, others were simply curious. They did not come seeking any kind of secret knowledge. They came because they wanted to live better lives. One of those students would become especially important. His name was Arrian. Unlike Epictetus, Arrian enjoyed writing. He carefully recorded many of his teacher's conversations. Without him, we might know almost nothing about Epictetus today. In many ways, Arrian became for Epictetus what Plato had been for Socrates, the devoted student who preserved a teacher's voice for future generations. The books we now know as the Discourses and the Enchiridion or Handbook were written down by Arrian from Epictetus' teachings. That means something rather beautiful. When we read the words of Epictetus today, we're often listening not to polished essays, but to conversations. Questions asked by ordinary students, answers given by thoughtful teacher. Perhaps that is why his writing feels so alive. You can almost imagine yourself sitting quietly in the room, listening as one student asks, "What should I do when life becomes difficult?" And another wonders, "How do I deal with people who are unfair?" Someone else quietly asks, "How can I stop being afraid?" These are not ancient questions. They are human questions. The kind that appear in every century. The kind that still appear in our own lives. And before offering complicated answers, Epictetus returned again and again to one simple idea. There are things we can control, and there are things we cannot. Learning the difference, he believed, was the beginning of wisdom. Tonight, we'll spend a little time exploring what he meant, because those quiet conversations held in a modest school nearly 2,000 years ago still have something to teach us. And the room is quiet. Morning light filters gently through the open doorway. Outside, the city is already awake. Footsteps pass along the street. Somewhere nearby, a merchant calls to his first customers of the day. Inside, a small group of students sits together. There are no grand chairs, no elaborate decorations, only a teacher, a few wooden benches, and a conversation that has continued for centuries. Epictetus looks around the room before speaking. His voice is calm, measured, patient. He begins as he often does, not with an answer, but with a question. What truly belongs to you? And the students hesitate. One quietly replies, "My home." Another answers, "My family." "My work." "My reputation." "My health." Epictetus smiles gently. Then little by little he examines each answer. Can a home be lost? Yes. In a fire. Can wealth disappear? Of course, with a few uncareful decisions. Can health change? Certainly. Can other people decide what they think about you? Every single day. One by one, the things that seemed permanent begin to reveal themselves as uncertain. Not because life is cruel, but because life is always changing. Then Epictetus offers another possibility. There is one thing, he says, that remains truly yours. Your judgments, your choices, the way you respond to what happens. Not what happens, but how you meet it. It is a simple distinction, yet it changes everything. Imagine standing in the rain. You cannot command the clouds to disappear. You cannot order the wind to become still, but you can decide whether to greet the storm with anger or with acceptance. The Stoics never suggested that difficult events stop being difficult. They simply believed that suffering often grows heavier when we demand that reality become something other than it is. This did not mean becoming passive. If you can improve a situation, you should improve it. If someone needs help and you can offer it, help them. If an injustice can be corrected, work to correct it. But after you have done what is within your power, do not spend your remaining strength fighting what no longer belongs to you. That idea may sound familiar today. Modern psychology often speaks about the importance of recognizing what we can influence and letting go of what lies beyond our control. Although the language has changed over the centuries, the underlying insight remains remarkably similar. Much of our emotional suffering comes not only from difficult events themselves, but from the exhausting effort to control what cannot be controlled. Epictetus understood this long before psychology became a science, not because he had special knowledge, but because life had taught him difficult lessons. He knew what it meant to lose freedom, to face uncertainty, to live in circumstances he had never chosen. And still, he discovered that another kind of freedom remained untouched, the freedom to choose his character, the freedom to decide whether hardship would make him better, or bitter, or wiser. As the lesson comes to an end, the students remain seated. For a moment, no one rushes to speak. Some ideas ask for silence before they ask for agreement or judgment. Perhaps this is one of them. You find yourself quietly considering the same question that opened today's lesson. What truly belongs to you? It is not an easy question. Perhaps it was never meant to be easy. But it is a question worth carrying for a little while, just as generations of students have done before us. As the years passed, more and more students found their way to Epictetus. Some traveled great distances, others remained for months, even years. They did not come because he promised an easy life. Quite the opposite. Epictetus believed that life would always contain uncertainty, always contain disappointment, always contain moments beyond our control. His promise was something much quieter. That is what is possible to meet those moments with dignity. One visitor who met Epictetus later wrote that his presence alone seemed to encourage people to examine their own lives, not through fear, not through shame, but through honesty. He had an unusual gift. He could ask simple questions that stayed with people long after the conversation had ended. Perhaps that is one reason his students remembered him so clearly. He was not interested in winning arguments. He was interested in helping people become wiser. Unlike many famous philosophers, Epictetus lived quite simply, Ancient sources describe him as owning very little. He believed that happiness depended far less upon possessions than upon character. There is a story told many years after his death that someone once stole the iron lamp he used for studying. Rather than becoming angry, Epictetus simply replaced it with a clay one. Whether every detail of that story is historically correct, we cannot know with certainty, but it reflects something that appears consistently through his teachings. Objects can be replaced, character cannot. Late in life, another story appears in the ancient tradition surrounding Epictetus. It tells us that he adopted a young child who might otherwise have been abandoned. An elderly woman helped care for the child in his household. Some historians debate the details of this account because our surviving evidence is scarce and limited. Yet, if the story is true, it reveals something deeply consistent with the philosophy he taught. Compassion was not merely an idea, it was something to be practiced. This is one of the reasons Epictetus continues to feel surprisingly modern. He did not ask people to withdraw from the world, he asked them to participate in it with integrity, to fulfill their responsibilities, to care for others, to remain honest, to remain fair, to remember that every human being possesses inherent dignity, regardless of wealth, status, or power. Perhaps that is the greatest misunderstanding about Stoicism, is that it encourages people not to care. Epictetus taught almost the opposite. Care deeply, but care wisely. Love people, knowing they are precious precisely because life is uncertain. Work diligently without believing your worth depends entirely upon your success. Meet difficulty with courage, not because it is pleasant, but because courage becomes visible only when something difficult must be faced. As the afternoon light begins to fade, the lesson draws quietly to its close. Some students gather their notes, others remain seated, reflecting silently. No applause follows, no grand conclusion is announced, only the quiet understanding that wisdom rarely arrives at once. It grows slowly, conversation by conversation, choice by choice, and day by day. Perhaps that is why the teachings of Epictetus have endured for nearly 2,000 years. Not because they offer perfect certainty, but because they gently invite us to become just a little more thoughtful than we were yesterday. The room gradually empties, the benches grow still. Outside, the evening light settles softly over Nicopolis. Another day's conversations have come to its end. Their echoes will continue much longer. Evening settles quietly over the town. The last of the students have made their way home. The classroom is empty once again. A few lamps still burn slowly. Their gentle light stretches across the wooden floor. The day's conversations have come to an end. But their questions remain. Perhaps that is the nature of philosophy. Good philosophy rarely gives us something to memorize. Instead, it gives us something to return to again and again. Throughout his life, Epictetus owned very little compared with the wealthy men of Rome. He held no political office. He commanded no armies. His face was never stamped onto coins. He built no great monuments, and yet, nearly 2,000 years later, his voice still reaches us, not through marble statues or imperial decrees, but through conversations. A teacher speaking with his students, a student carefully writing down those conversations, generation after generation choosing to preserve them. There is something beautifully fitting about that. The man who began life without freedom became one of history's greatest teachers of inner freedom. And not because his life was easy, but because he refused to let hardship decide the kind of person he would become. Perhaps that is the quiet thread connecting every life we've explored together. The scholars of Alexandria believed that knowledge should be preserved. Marcus Aurelius believed that character should be practiced. Epictetus reminds us that wisdom is available to anyone willing to seek it. Not only to emperors, not only to scholars, not only to those born into privilege, but to every thoughtful person who pauses long enough to ask, what kind of human do I hope to become? It is an ancient question, yet it will never grow old. Outside, the evening breeze moves gently through the olive trees. Somewhere in the distance, waves meet the shore. The world continues exactly as it always has. Children laugh, travelers continue their journeys, merchants prepare for another morning. The stars begin appearing one by one above the quiet city. Long after empires have disappeared, they remain. Epictetus often reminded his students that we do not control how long our lives will be, but we do have some influence over how we choose to live them. Not perfectly. No one lives a perfect life. Not Marcus Aurelius, not Epictetus, not any philosopher who has ever walked or will walk this earth. Perhaps wisdom is not perfection after all. Perhaps wisdom is simply returning each day to the values we hope to live by, patiently, honestly, again and again, as our evening together comes to a close. There is no final lesson to memorize, no list of rules to carry home, only a quiet invitation to remain curious, to notice your own thoughts, to meet tomorrow with a little more patience than yesterday, and to remember that some of history's greatest teachers did not ask us to become extraordinary. They asked us to become fully human. Thank you for spending this evening in the quiet library. Wherever you are, whether the day has been joyful or difficult, whether your mind is busy or already beginning to grow quiet, I hope tonight's volume has offered you a small measure of peace. The library will be here whenever you wish to return. Another shelf, another story, another remarkable life waiting to be discovered by you. Until then, may your mind rest, may your curiosity remain alive, and may tonight bring you deep, peaceful sleep. Good night.